so I see some familiar faces, some very new faces. So for a lot of you who may know me, some parts of this you may already know. But for the benefit of everyone today, I'm going to start with a small story. I grew up as a English as a second language speaker. So I spoke in my mother tongue, which is Marwadi, at home. My parents, my mother speaks some amount of English, my father none. And they decided to enroll me in a convent school, right? Because they thought like, this is the future. So I'm at this school, and the school's run by a bunch of nuns who were educated in Europe, right? So they got all their training in management, education, admin, everything in Europe. So they had this very Western idea of what communication and learning looks like. So I was constantly shamed at school for not speaking proper English. But I had literally no place to practice because I'd go back home and I'm speaking in Marwadi at home. So what do? My only resort was to find books. Now, what books do I read? My parents had no idea what to get me. They said, you can either go to the store, get what you like, or read what you have at school. So I go to my school library, and these are the books that I found, right? A bunch of Enid Blyton books, The Famous Five, Secret Seven, Mallory Sisters. We did a lot of Roald Dahl, a lot of Roald Dahl. Now, these books had places that look like this. Pristine riversides and lakes where they take their boats out. You have snow-capped mountains where they're skiing, chilling, solving mysteries. And the books had people that looked like this and had names like Peter, Jack, Janet, right? Who then they're eating rhubarb pies and cakes and a steak with beans and peas. And I had no idea what half of them meant. But this was all that I had. These were all the books that I had. So what ended up happening is I ended up reading books. I ended up accessing literature where there was only one story, one kind of culture being shown. I never grew up seeing myself or my culture or anybody who looked like me in any of these books. So when the time came, now I got really good, okay? By this point, I was reading, I was overcompensating for not being a good student as per my principal. So I got really good with my language. I got really good with writing, actually. So when the time came, we had a student play production every year. And my teacher came to me and she's like, you know what, Aanchal, you write the play and you direct it. Now, I got very excited. I was like, this is it. This is my moment. I said, I'm going to write something that I haven't read all these years. I'm going to have a story that is familiar to me. I'm going to write about people that look like me. So I end up writing this brilliant play about the city of Mumbai. And you have policemen who are extremely unhappy with their job, but have these little inside jokes going on. I wrote about a bunch of kids who loved skipping schools and had these really good moments of friendships, but they weren't by a lakeside or on snow-capped mountains. They were in the streets of the city or in their colony spaces. Now, I wrote this play. I had a bunch of Hindi songs, right? So I wanted to make it a musical. So I added a bunch of Hindi songs and I got people to choreograph it. I've introduced dialogues in Hindi, Marathi. There's a bunch of English as well. That I was like, this is my play. So we do all of this. My teacher's happy with it. 2 weeks before we're staging the play, we do a tech rehearsal. And my principal comes to watch it. And she's flabbergasted. She asks, who did this? And I go into her office and for 30 minutes, she's asking me, what is this? What is this nonsense? You know, the play's supposed to be in English. What are these jokes you've added? What are these characters you've added? And in one sweeping move, the play gets cancelled. And she takes it upon herself to pick a play which is very Western, very English, very British, actually. All the songs get shelved, replaced by songs I had never even heard about, right? So now we're dancing to those songs, which make no sense to me, frankly. But now from a writer, from a playwright and director, I become a dancer. That's my only role in the play. Now, these books that I read had left a profound impact on me, right? They spurred my imagination, creativity, but that single story, reading that very uniform culture, and this moment where my principal, who is a figure of authority in my life, tells me that your story is not valid. What this led to me internalizing was that only certain stories are valid for the stage. There are only certain stories that are good, which represent a certain culture. So it was a long time actually before I took up to writing another play. I actually stopped writing. I was like, yeah, nobody wants to hear about this, it's fine. Let's just, let other people write it, or we'll work with plays that have already been written by someone else. Now, years later, however, I read works by Indian playwrights. I read Vijay Tendulkar, I read Mashweta Devi, I read Girish Karnad, and I realized, I said, there is place to put this kind of literature out. There is a place to put your story out. But in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that when we homogenize and we normalize a certain amount of uniformity where one culture, one narrative takes precedence over others, what does that mean for us? Is that the complete picture of how things are? Or are we only giving out partial pictures of what reality looks like, of what a valid voice looks like? And that really is the core moment where a lot of my work into DEI started, where I became highly aware about what representation does for us, and as a child, what it did for me. So in an educational space, in your formative years, if you're able to engage with this idea of representation, of voices even, what does that mean for us? And that's what actually brings us to diversity, equality, and inclusion. And we start by asking whose voices are being heard, but more importantly, whose voices are missed? Whose voices are we not hearing? Whose voices are eclipsed from all the mainstream narratives? So for the sake of our talk today, let's just set some context. Does anybody recognize him?
Franklin?
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin. Yeah, we studied about him in school. He was one of the architects of the American Constitution. We studied the American War of Independence in great detail about him too. And we also studied that he was not just a very politically astute person, he was actually a really good scientist. And the lightning rod, which is to direct electricity into the ground to ensure that nobody gets electrocuted, was his invention. Now, I was in awe of this man. I said, wow, what a diverse set of skills. And that's what I held for more than half my life. No, almost all my life until last year. So last year I was in Washington and I went to the American Museum of History. And they had this whole ground floor exhibit on Benjamin Franklin. So I had all these school memories coming back to me. I walked through the exhibit and I realized that Benjamin Franklin, while he was a key advocate of the anti-slavery movement, for a very long time he employed enslaved folks on his plantation, and he also traded them. And in fact, a lot of his experiments were conducted on enslaved people. And these folks were the ones who actually ran the crank, which is a electrostatic conductor. They were the ones who ran, which allowed him to conduct the experiments in the first place. And I just stood there reading that, and I realized that once again, we were told a story that was only half. And what do half stories do? They give us truth that is not really complete. They give us truth that is partial, that is not very accurate. And that is the danger of a single story, of a story that is not giving you the whole picture and allowing you to shape perspectives, to shape opinions that are truly reflective of what actually went on. So when we look at the terms diversity, inclusion, and equality, what do they mean? Kimmy rightly brought up in my introduction, it's like a hot topic. Everyone's talking about it, especially in the corporate space, right? You have HRs and you have huge budgets to bring in this discussion into our culture. So what does diversity stand? In various sense, it looks at not just recognizing, but actually celebrating this idea of difference. It is recognizing that we're all different, we're all unique, and we have unique strengths and traits, and we actually celebrate them. Inclusion looks at this idea of systems, processes, and culture. It reflects on this idea that everyone, irrespective of who they are, in a certain environment should feel like they belong there and that they can thrive and realize their fullest potential. And lastly, when we come to equality, now at the core of it, equality is fair treatment for everyone, right? And there's a new word called equity that exists. So the definition of equality was seen as very limited. So equity is more broad in its scope, where it says that it's not just about fair assessment anymore, but it is about proactively eliminating any barriers that may exist to realizing equal treatment for everyone and actively working towards rectifying past inequalities. So what is it that we can do to minimize the barriers that various forms of discrimination have created and thereby actually realize equal treatment for all? Now, while, of course, these are great terms to look at and talk about, I realized that in terms of structured efforts, right, there are multiple things that we can do. And this is what led me to really starting Thought Project, because I wanted to provide organizations with that kind of holistic support to design practices, to start conversations around these ideas, not just at the level of a definition, that, okay, we get the concept, now we can go home, but really focus on how this translates to our fabric, to our very existence, and then gets reproduced in everything that we do. Now, while I was working with my team on developing various projects, doing several trainings, we realized there are two chief problems that exist within the DEI landscape. Number one is that we're talking, but we're talking a lot. And that's where we're stopping. We just talk about it. We feel great when we have these groups that we're organizing. We're having very critical intellectual conversations. We feel great about ourselves, and then we go back home. And that's where it ends, that we're not actually doing enough about it, right? And the second one, and this is really at the core of what I'm going to get on to next, is that it's missing local context. So a lot of the frameworks and definitions and understanding of DEI that we have is very Western in nature. Because when we look at language itself, right, when we look at English as a language, it is very Western in its origins. So what we've ended up doing is, especially within the Global South, is import various Western models and apply it as is to local contexts, which is really not helping us, because then the conversations end at a certain point. So just to give you an example, we're very comfortable in India, especially, we're very comfortable talking about race, right? Racism in the US. We're talking about Black Lives Matter. We're talking about what are historic inequalities with regard to race that took place in the US. However, we don't look at how race manifests in India. There is active racism in India that goes on, but we're not really looking at that, right? Because when we talk about discrimination, our image thought goes to the West. We talk about it. We think we've understood what inclusion means, and that's where we stop. Or how many of us actively talk about caste? A survey in India actually concluded that more than half the country's population belongs to the lower castes. And yet, actively, we're refraining from talking about caste and looking at what sort of historic inequalities and discrimination has been perpetuated based on caste identities. So this sort of local context is actively missing. Further, when we talk about local context also, the question is, who is really talking about DEI and in what spaces? So when you look at workplaces, you'll have your senior upper management talking about it, who already are so far removed from the larger teams that anything that they then do is very, very distant from the actual needs of the group. And it is some of these thoughts actually that brought us to DSB. So Dr. Howard reached out this one fine day. He had a very clear vision of a DEI approach that the school needs to take, active work on diversity, equality, inclusion. But what followed next was the real push factor for us to come to DSB, where he said that as a British man, I am far removed from the local context. And we really need someone who understands the context, is able to really work with all the stakeholders in the school to lead this effort. And DSB at the moment is one of the few or only school in the country at the moment that is doing concerted efforts for diversity, equality, inclusion. So I'm going to spend some time walking you through the process. Now, before we started, the objective always was to bring it back to curriculum, right? How is it that we can start these conversations around DEI, translate it into student learning, ensure that they can really access a more global education? But we realized to get that is like missing 10 steps. So we came in and we started a 3-step process. The first thing we did is to review. So we decided to review all existing policies, procedures that the school has in place. We reviewed everything that the school is already doing or not doing. Okay, so that was a desk review that we did. We then had focus group discussions with all stakeholders in the school. So this included parents, students, teaching staff, admin staff, support staff. And we conducted these focus group discussions in local languages as well to ensure that every voice is heard. We enabled not just table discussions, but even anonymous sharing to ensure that nobody feels like they cannot put their view forth. Once we had all this information, we realized 2 things. One, there were definite gaps, right? There were definite things that the school could do, actions that the school could take. But the second thing we realized, there's a lot that's already happening in the school, but it's not codified into documents, into policies. Now, what that leads to is that a lot of people couldn't access or weren't aware about these provisions at all, and hence couldn't use them. So the next step, what we did is to formulate. We went ahead and drafted 8 policies for the school. So this is the larger DEI policy, but a range of supporting policies as well. So we now have a gender and sexuality policy to guide the school in engaging with students of diverse gender and sexual identities. We have a new parents' leave policy for members of staff at the school. We also have a larger DEI policy with a huge appendage that actually lays down the local context. So anybody who comes to the DSB family, because we have so much international staff and student population, where's that orientation into the local context for them? So that appendage really orients you that, okay, this is the context that we're operating in, and this is what the policy is then working to address. We ended up also creating a prevention of sexual harassment policy, which is a legal mandate, but you'd be surprised to know how many schools and even companies in this country do not have an active prevention of sexual harassment committee. So we now not just have the policy, but we have a fully trained and equipped committee to investigate into these issues should they come up. Now, you may wonder at this point that, we're talking about staff a lot, we're talking about different stakeholders, but the theme of the conference is, student education assessment. Well, one of the things to reflect, and the reason why we progressed in this manner, is that for students to receive holistic education that is valuable, impactful, you need the staff to be in a place that respects their well-being and is safe for them and inclusive as well. So this step was fixing that foundational space before we even move to curriculum. So now that we've got these policies, okay, we realized, okay, great, we have a well-being policy, we have mental health explicitly stated in the health policy of the school. Earlier we spoke about physical health, did a lot on mental health, but it wasn't codified into the policy, and now it's explicitly there. So anyone experiencing mental health issues now has a roadmap to accessing care and support at the school. So now we got all these policies in place, we moved to implementation. So over the span of 1 year, extensive trainings were held with specific stakeholders to orient them on these several policies we have, measures that are in place for their support, for their well-being. And once these trainings were done, we looked at now what are the different ways in which we can implement these policies. So one of the first things that we looked at is the curriculum. So the personal social health curriculum that we have, the PSHE one, underwent a rigorous review. Now, in that, we realized that a lot of policies, for instance, the gender and sexuality policy spoke a lot about providing support for diverse gender and sexual identities. So the PSHE curriculum was modified to reflect that policy, to provide more wider education on these different identities and what that means, again, in the local context. We also modified the approach to make the curriculum more positive and more empowering for students. And the next step, while it was to start looking at specific subjects and look at the ways in which they can bring in ideas of DEI, of course, when we look at challenges, you'll see that got pushed by a year due to more immediate curriculum needs. Now, what was some of the impact and lessons that we learned from this process? Now, of course, we have policies, which is great. It is fantastic for stakeholders to have rights and to be able to access them. But what we've realized is that a lot of staff members have now started thinking about their experiences in the classroom and outside and how the policies support them. So for instance, the gender and sexuality policy has been very helpful in navigating the issue of room assignment on trips for gender non-conforming students. And the policy provides a guided roadmap for staff members to navigate this effectively. We've had several members of staff who've joined very recently talk about these policies and how having them really reaffirmed their faith in the school's commitment to DEI. We've also had the POSH policy, in fact, for a lot of staff members who didn't know that this was required. This became a really empowering space for them. In addition to that, we've also now started looking at collaborating with other schools to take this project with them. In many ways, this was almost like a pilot project for us. Because many schools are not doing something this in-depth and this long, this has been a 2.5-year process. We are now looking for ways to take this to other schools to really say that this is what it looked like for us. So we're doing a case study with the COBIS, which is the Council of British International Schools. We're also working with the OECD Schools Plus initiative to carry forward some of these learnings to them. But in terms of lessons learned, it has not been all smooth and linear. There's been a lot of times where we've had to go back to the drawing board, realize that certain things need to either be pushed to later, priorities had to be reorganized. Like the curricular review, like I said, was to take place this year, but there were more urgent academic needs that needed to be addressed. So that got pushed to next year. Certain collaboration initiatives have also been pushed to next year. So talking about DEI and talking about implementation of DEI, it's a long process. It's not a one panel, one conference, one training initiative, as most organizations would like to believe. And having been in this space, I constantly see the conversation being, we'll give you 3 hours. Can you cover DEI, do 1 hour each topic because we need to do this training this year. And it's really shocking to see that that's the kind of commitment that exists towards something that is so all-pervasive to everything that we do. So it's a long process. It requires time, resources, but more than anything, it is a process that requires a lot of collaboration. So throughout our process and work that we do with organizations, we're never sitting in one office doing our thing, presenting reports. It's always extremely collaborative with the various stakeholders and ensuring that it is those voices from the bottom up that actually guide the process. So before I end, I want to leave you just with one thought, that talking about DEI can be very discomforting. And we have seen that happen where people, the minute you start reflecting and realize ways in which maybe unconscious biases come to the fore, ways in which you realize that perhaps something went wrong earlier and perhaps you didn't realize it, right? Talking about DEI is going to create a lot of discomfort. My only message to you is to sit with it. Sit with the discomfort, dig in a little deeper, entertain it, if I may say, and you'll be surprised to see the learnings that come from it. So I'm going to stop here, and thank you for being such an audience. If anyone has any questions on what I said, on what the school is doing, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
I'm trying to formulate in my head so it doesn't come out as being controversial, however it's going to. I was really interested in a couple of things. When I was about to film you, but you'd finished saying, well, I wanted to film you, so that's why I just looked to see whether it's being filmed.
Sure.
About the caste system here in India. Now, I have friends in other cities in India, and there's kind of I've been told that, no, that doesn't exist anymore. Does it?
So legally, caste discrimination has been, that there are measures that ensure equality. And India had a practice called untouchability for very long, where lower castes were seen as impure and contaminated, and one upper castes must not come into contact. So untouchability was ruled out in the constitution. It's an offense to practice that. But just because something has been ruled out or something the constitution says doesn't mean that it's actually happening. In fact, if you keep up with the news, there have been a bunch of cases in educational spaces, in higher education, engineering colleges and universities, where caste-based discrimination is actively practiced. And the thing with caste is that it often is very, very implicit, the discrimination that happens, where you're either not invited to networking spaces, promotions get restricted, and there's really no identifiable grounds really to call it out, right? One always has the opportunity to deny it, saying, no, 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 it wasn't on caste, it was on merit that was denied. So it becomes really hard to actually identify and pull it out, but it exists actively. You would still see news where a Dalit boy tried to access a community well, and he was beaten up for doing that because you're from a lower caste and you're not supposed to do that. Temple entries are also limited, where you're not allowed to enter into temples if you're from a certain caste. So it is very, very much present.
And that's refreshing. I've got a second part of that, if that's okay. Is that you're talking about, well, and I'm agreeing, but one of the things that is refreshing to hear from anybody is that when you're saying that you talk about racism, and it's, in, I think, the world's eye, it is a white issue. It's a white crime, if that makes sense. Only we do it, and we only do it to black people. It's kind of that let's say talk about George Floyd, who when you introduce something like this, it's refreshing to say that yes, it does happen in other countries, and I've been to, luckily enough, to a lot of countries, and I see it, even between, say, tribes.
Yeah.
But then it leads us on to when then policies come in, and it's quite rightly so. When they come in a little bit too quickly, there is, I mean, you can have two things. You can have positive discrimination, but also some policies, if they're not handled correctly, like any weapon, they become weaponized. So that people who are, and I'm not suggesting that I'm downtrodden in any way, but the tables can turn a little bit where people are actually scared to use the words that you're using, because it can be turned, if you like. What do you put in place to stop these things being weaponized?
You know, the number of times this concern comes up. In fact, we were at a prevention of sexual harassment committee training, and this came up very often, right? What if false cases get filed? What if malicious intent drives people to filing complaints? That is always the possibility. That is always, you come up with any measure, like you rightly said, right? However, when you look at numbers, right, the number of people who actually benefit from using the policy versus those who may misuse it, the numbers are quite telling, right? And when, of course, misuse happens, policies do have measures in place. So the POSH policy at the school does have a provision in place where the committee can investigate if a complaint has been made with malicious intent, and there are penalties that have been laid out that will be meted out in case that is proven. So I feel as policies, it is important to recognize that misuse can happen. However, policies cannot be based on the potential of misuse, because then it defeats the very purpose of it actually helping and providing relief to those who've been aggrieved.
Yeah, and all of our policies are emphatic, yet there is a section where if you have misused this, you're going to face the consequences.
Yeah. Okay, no, that does, because that does answer it. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I've heard all of this. It's really wonderful, and I think in all this conversation, one of the biggest conversations of showing how we considering what you're doing it, but as a parent as well as I've been head of POSH communities and other companies and stuff. And one of the biggest biggest problem I find in every system, not just the schooling system in this country, is the classism more than any of the other things we've spoken about. I mean, I've been living in another country for the last few years, and I just came back and I went to the Reliance store below the house, and I was the only woman there, and it was full of boys from different parts of North India, shopping for their main selves. And even for the children, like for security reasons, you have a driver and a maid and whatever. Because of the rich becoming richer, the poor becoming poorer, a lot of, everybody wants an iPhone, but the staff can't have it. Yesterday I went out for dinner and this lady had more jewelry on her. I mean, if I just took her and sold her, I'd buy myself a house, I swear to God. And so the difference is so vast. And then you have children right from a tiny age, being fed by somebody, carried by somebody, that person sleeping on the floor, there in the bed, you're in the AC, they're sweating in the kitchen. And it sort of becomes normal. Even in school, you have PTs and teachers, and there's a hierarchy. And unfortunately, it's not going to go, because the system in this country is very much sort of based on that. And the other issue when it comes to your boss or even the staff interaction between various tiers of staff, sensitization to, for example, you have a child who's come from a Western country, they're wearing a little top, little tiny little shorts, and that's perfectly normal. And you have staff who have come literally fresh off the boat from a place where they're fairly conservative. The male staff have left their families at home, and the sensitization culturally, what it means to be in this environment, sensitization for the children to understand, what is the difference in this, and how do we strive to make it so that, because we always want to be equal with people bigger than us. I mean, I'm happy to be combined, I swear to God, but I don't really want to be equal sleeping on the floor, with my staff quarters. So equality, unfortunately, means we want to be better than we are and equal to the person above us. Not that we come down to the lowest level and understand what that means. And so I think that sensitization, unless that comes in through the entire ecosystem of whichever, whether it's a company, a government, whatever, school, none of the other things can be impacted, especially in the Asian countries or countries that have this dichotomy where Mr. Franklin had slaves, we have a Bai at home. I mean, it's not that far. We do not feel that we're doing anything wrong because we're helping that person by paying them, and it's a capitalist system and there's a value to your effort, and you don't want to be pity feeding someone. So it's very complex, and it's not as simple as, hey, we put in a policy and it's gone. No, it's an everyday reminder to the child, to yourself, to everybody. Like you said, sit in that hard space. But we definitely have this, all opposites are true in this country.
No, I think you brought out quite a lot. So I'm going to try my best to respond to that. Class is it's a universal concept, and it's a highly visible concept, right? Class disparity is always visible. And like you said, I want to jump to this concept of equality as well, right? That we always want to strive to be treated equally to someone who's above us rather than in the class system who'd be below us. But in terms of the definition of equality, right? What we understand by equality, it's about access, right? And when we talk about access, it's, of course, in a capitalist system, it would be access to food, clothing, shelter. But it's also very often about access to opportunities. So when you look at education, right? Education is a right, but how many of us in this country have that access to get education that we want, to get education that would translate into well-paying jobs? So when we're talking about equality, we also want to start by addressing those. So our understanding of equality would start from the bottom, in fact, and then we gradually move up as we address some of those very pertinent issues. And one of the other things you brought up, right, about sensitizing, like how do we go about sensitizing about class? Because it's universal that anyone who's higher up in the hierarchy, their onus or their obligation to be sensitized is far lesser than those further down the hierarchy, right? So it's really that sort of disparity that we want to also engage with. That, okay, this is the existing system. Can we start educating ourselves about it? And as a school, can we start having those conversations? Because when you step outside of the school, start taking on professional jobs, you'll probably be the ones driving policy decisions, driving some of these conversations. So as a school, when we start having conversations around DI that is rooted in a local context, it becomes possible to equip students to take these conversations further. So I feel that that has been the approach, and that's what we want to do with the curricular review, that we've got these documents in place that give us some sort of a roadmap. You know, this is the direction that we're headed in, and now these are the measures that we can do to respond to that policy.
I want to say, I think I'd like to take this back to the beginning of your talk, because that to me is the most impactful part of it. Education is about voice, and not only about giving everybody the opportunity to have their voice, but about giving everybody the opportunity to benefit from the diversity. We all know that neurodiversity is in fact an incredibly valuable thing, and yet there's an awful lot of education that tries to stamp down on it. Equally, diversity of cultural experience is hugely valuable. Class is one of the real challenges within a school where obviously most people are exceptionally wealthy. The only people who don't really fit in that category are people whose companies or consumers are paying for them, and they're still pretty middle class. So, what for me the driver here is that we are all richer for hearing others' voices and for having that greater, wider perspective. And I think in my job as what can I deliver to students, that is an empowering thing that they take forward into the world. So they don't go forward to the world dismissing the other, but rather embracing the other. It's less about a moral journey and more about a mind-opening journey.
I have one last question. What was the British play that you had to do instead of?
I don't remember very well, but there used to be this book called The Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul. There used to be this, you know, they used to publish it annually. They used to be for teenage soul, for the adult soul. They had like a bunch of these books, and they'd do these crowd-sourced stories, poems, and plays. So I think she picked up one of those moral value-based stories, and she sort of improvised a play on that. It was quite boring, honestly.
They usually are.
Any other questions? Any thoughts, ruminations?
One of the things that I found to be, as a white woman, is that why the law says in the UK that everything is equal, we get paid the same amount. In practice, in reality, that is certainly not true, and it is access to those opportunities. And I think what the conversation does, and what we've seen over the last few years, is that, for instance, the impact of Brexit was not actually on leaving Europe; it was on the country, and that has allowed the UK to become racist and outwardly racist again. And I think one of the things that, and not towards people of colour actually, towards Europeans, which was quite unusual and and pretty awful. So I think one of the things which is important for me as a person, as a woman, and within school, is to have the conversations so that people know that it's not okay. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes, a lot of the times, is that children are children. They go through the swearing stage, which is lovely. We all delight in that stage. They go through the swearing stage, and then they have to stop it. Then they go through the homophobic slur stage. They go through the racist stage, and the whole point of it is we have to have the conversations out loud and not hidden to say, no, that's not really acceptable. We can't stop the thoughts, but we can stop what's happening in school and what's happening in school.
And also, just to respond to you, I think it is the idea of asking questions. I think for a very long time, education systems have not encouraged asking questions, right? So even when we do say this is not okay and it must stop, it'll be great if students ask, but why? Right? Okay, you're saying to stop, I probably will, but why do you want me to stop? And I feel it's really that spirit of inquiry that DSB does so well to encourage that will get us to thinking and asking far more critical questions and really expand conversations beyond just what textbooks are saying. So.
Yeah, but I think, it's also important to keep the conversation going. because formulating a policy
Yeah.
is one part of it, and it's good if you have somebody some documentation available for anyone to refer to when you have a situation. But it's much more open, aggressive. If you have the conversation, we're very happy. It's being discussed in open forum right now. But to continue from that aspect, engage with children, get their feedback and point of view, which really then can build up from there. So I think that's it's a great beginning. So lovely.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, all right. I think that is our time. And we have the networking lunch after this. So thank you everyone for coming in and being such an engaged audience. I'm really honored that you took the time to think, process, and ask questions and start conversations that I hope you will continue outside of this room as well. Thank you everyone.